Hi, I'm John with the Christian Century. I'm joined today by one of the poets who writes for our magazine, Josh Dugat. We're going to be reading a recent piece he wrote for the Christian Century called Mr. Icarus. And we're going to chat about that. But first, Josh, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, John. Thanks very much for having me. I'm talking to you from Tuscaloosa, Alabama right now, where I live with my wife and children. I teach here, and we also grow a big garden out back, bake a lot of bread. I make some woodblock prints, and get to read and write as well, and talk to folks about it. So
That's
again,
great. That sounds like some cool interests. Why don't we start before we talk about the poem? Why don't we actually hear it? So if you wouldn't mind reading this piece for us, Josh, go ahead whenever you're ready.
all right. This is Mr. Icarus. The house was what? A quarter mile away from ours? Elm and green St. Augustine, two-car mirage, assortment of machines built to persuade weeds with blades, and an airplane. Well, the start of one, a wooden bird born bones first and growing rib by moonward rib, a pterodactyl skeleton, a cage to wrap an angel in. Whose permission are you waiting for? How long will you risk not plummeting, leaving someone else's hero to the summiting? The neighbors, let the neighbors stir. The grave can have its gravity. One bright day, and the garage was empty.
Thank you. That's really
Thanks.
cool. Well, first of all, I wanted to ask, this poem reads like a memory that you have lived of coming across this skeletal kind of airplane, wondering when it will fly. So I'm just curious, like, did something like this happen to you? Is this based on a true story?
Yes, I grew up in Austin, Texas, and I grew up in a residential neighborhood with elm and oak and pecan trees in yards, and we walked quite a bit, school, church, whatnot. And probably 2 or 3 blocks from ours, there was a gentleman who was working on a airplane there, which for like an 8 to 10-year-old was sort of wild. I think both to imagine that these things that you see and fly on have a human element. There's human labor and ingenuity behind them, and then also just that every closed garage from here to infinitum could have any number of things in them, and in fact do. And so I think that has stuck with me for a long time and finally eked itself out here.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm glad it did. So I always like to ask when we have a poet on the channel, writing poetry is just not something I do. So I'm curious what that's like for you. Is there a process, or just what is it like for you to approach writing a new poem?
Thank you. It remains somewhat mysterious even to me, and I love that, and I'm humbled by it. Oftentimes there will be some sort of image or theme or memory, for example, that you can't shake, and you find stories that remind you of this. In this case, the Icarus story, somehow connecting these was one moment of grace that appeared. And then you find also these moments of grace with like words that just that come, that have resonance with one another. And it happens over a long period of time. I'm not especially prolific or speedy when these things happen. Whenever I am driving a long distance or have a moment to, sometimes lying in bed when you can't sleep, these little associations, if I am able to jot them down, ultimately the catalog sort of gets churned out into something like this. But it's sometimes it takes a while.
Yeah.
Reading
Well,
also, reading is just also
mhm.
the other part of that well.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up the title of the poem, Mr. Icarus. I was thinking about this poem earlier, and the tension between ambition and adventure, but like hubris and caution, and because it seems like in the poem you're wanting that plane to take off, but the meaning of the myth of Icarus, I think, is to be careful that you don't fly too early or too high. So I thought that was just really cool. I wasn't sure fully what the connection was, but I like that you just titled the poem that and then didn't really return to it necessarily in the piece.
Thank you for bringing that up. And that is true that I think even in my awareness, we know about the fall of Icarus. I mean, that is the Bruegel painting. Auden has a great poem about it. There's another, lots of people have written poems about Icarus. There's another poem by a poet named Jack Gilbert uh, that begins, everyone forgets that Icarus also flew. And I think that this is sort of the inversion or reclaiming that is encouraging to me. I didn't especially have Gilbert's poem in mind when I wrote this, but I needed that encouragement. And so like this line, whose permission are you waiting for? I say that so like to myself so that it might be true, because I am so often timid or cautious or afraid to build the airplane.
Wow. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. That's really cool. Final thing I wanted to ask you about, I noticed in this poem and Screen, a previous poem that we published in the Century, that you wrote, there's this really cool wordplay. In this piece, I really liked two car mirage and the grave can have its gravity. And I'm just curious how these turns of phrase work their way into your poems. Like I sort of picture you have some of these in your pocket or something, but maybe they come about naturally as you write. I'm just curious about some of those choices.
Thank you. It also sometimes, as we were speaking earlier, sometimes whenever you're not even thinking about it, these word associations pop up, and uh, we all have our sort of impulses for what we collect, and I think strange, goofy words, rhyme. I love rhyme. So even just these delightful noises that poems can make, that we make when we open our mouths, those are sometimes the engine behind what gets things going, even before you have a story or but before you have meaning. And so I don't particularly recall how those words came about, but I will say that if it makes me happy or makes me attentive to something that I hadn't been before, then it's my hope that it could do the same for somebody else. So, and I again have, centuries of poets and thinkers and speakers and musicians and whatnot ahead of us, or behind us, I should say, that have helped model what that delight can look like. So
That's great. Well, I find these phrases delightful. So we're going to close our chat with one more reading of the poem. I was speaking with Josh earlier, and he suggested that I read it the second time to get the poem read in another voice. So I'm happy to read Mr. Icarus by Josh Dugas. The house was what, a quarter mile away from ours? Elm and Green St. Augustine, two-car mirage, assortment of machines built to persuade weeds with blades, and an airplane. Well, the start of one, a wooden bird, born bones first and growing, rib by moonward rib, a pterodactyl skeleton, a cage to wrap an angel in. Whose permission are you waiting for? How long will you risk not plummeting, leaving someone else's hero to the summiting? The neighbors, let the neighbors stir. The grave can have its gravity. One bright day, and the garage was empty.
thanks so
All
much.
right. I always want to end a poem with amen. I don't know. There's something a little
Amen.
bit prayerful about words
Amen.
so artfully composed.
Well, that was a gift to hear. I've never heard anybody else read that poem before. So thanks so
Oh,
much.
I'm glad. Well, thank you so much for being here, Josh. Really cool to chat, and would love to chat again next time you write a poem for the Christian Century. Um, For those of you out there, if you haven't gotten to read the poem yet with your own eyes, we have a link below in the video description where you can go read Mr. Icarus. And yeah, thanks so much, Josh.
Thanks very much, John.